And thanks everyone for just a few moments. I am going live streaming. Well, here we are, everyone. Hi, I'm Heidi Rhodes, and welcome to Stamp Chat. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's April 15th, and here in the United States, it's referred to as Tax Day, meaning the day which individual income tax returns are due to the federal government. Today's Stamp Chat pays tribute to Tax Day with the historical context of taxation, financing the new country, an eye-opening, educational, and captivating presentation by Ron Lesher, one of the leading philatelists in the field of revenue stamps. Ron Lesher is a prolific philatelic exhibitor and a nationally and internationally accredited judge. His column, The Tax Collector, has appeared in most issues of the American Stamp Dealer and Collector, and he has been a frequent contributor to the American Revenuer and State Revenue News. Ron's research also has appeared in the American Philatelist and the U.S. Specialist. He has twice been a guest curator with the National Postal Museum, most recently at the Revenue Stamp Frames in the Gross Gallery. Stamp Chat is a production of the American Philatelic Society. For over 40 years, the APS has organized and hosted the Summer Seminar of Philately. Summer Seminar offers a week of learning, and in this case, it'll be a month-long learning with distinguished instructors, a time to dig deep into specific studies and socialize with fellow collectors who understand the quirks of the hobby. Ron Lesher, our presenter, is an instructor along with other renowned philatelists. Registration opens May 1st, but you can check out the guide, the course catalog now at stamps.org/learn. So it's really a treat to have you here, Ron. Thank you so much for being our guest. And I'm totally excited to hear this different perspective of American history. So thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you for that delightful introduction, Heidi. We're going to talk tonight about the decade of the 1790s, what it took to finance the new country. And we're going to begin, and I'm going to do something that, why is it not advancing on me? Oh, there we go. Okay. I'm going to do something that one should never do with PowerPoints, and I'm going to read to you. This is from Federalist Paper number 12, written by our first Secretary of the Treasury, or about to become the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. In this paper, he writes, "In so opulent a nation as that of Britain, where direct taxes from superior wealth must be much more tolerable, and from the vigor of the government much more practicable than in America, far from the greatest part of the national revenue is derived from taxes of the indirect kind, from imposts and from excises. Duties or on imported articles form a large branch of this latter description." That word imposts is a word that we don't use very much today, but it specifically is referring to import duties. Continuing in Federalist Paper number 12, in America, it is evident that we must a long time depend for the means of revenue chiefly on such duties. In most parts of it, excises must be confined within a narrow compass. Excises being taxes on the manufacture, sale, or consumption of goods, or upon licenses to pursue certain occupations. In other words, Hamilton is arguing that we are going to have to depend upon import duties as a major means of financing the government. Now, we should also recall that part of what brought the 13 states together to ratify the Constitution was that the United States was to assume the debts of the states related to the Revolutionary War. And that was a major factor in why they ratified the Constitution. The states were eager to unload that debt on the national government. Moving on to another of the Federalist Papers, number 35. And this might have some echoes to the present. The maxim that the consumer is the payer is so much oftener true than the reverse of the proposition, that it is far more equitable that the duties on imports should go into a common stock, that they should redound to the exclusive benefit, than that they should redound to the exclusive benefit of the importing states. At the time of the end of national prohibition, the state of Kentucky was producing a lot of whiskey, and the federal government, had a tax on that whiskey. Irony, none of that money, some of that money came back to the state of Kentucky, even though Kentucky was not paying any of that taxes. Those taxes were passed on to the consumers in other states. And so this is a very important principle in Hamilton's vision of how taxes should operate within the new United States. Okay, enough reading of these things to you. Let's take a look. This is a fascinating document. It is from 1789. Virginia had already ratified the Constitution, and the state of Rhode Island had not. And this is if you were able to read this, this is a document that shows that goods have been shipped from Rhode Island to Virginia. And since Rhode Island is not part of the United States, not ratified the Constitution, the goods that have been shipped from Rhode Island are therefore subject to import duties. The amount of those import duties are 12 pounds. Wait a minute, 12 pounds? Yes, because the dollar had not yet been established as our national currency, and it is payable in Virginia currency. Well, you can imagine that the merchants of Rhode Island, and this in fact happened, urged the governor to bring the legislature back into session to ratify the Constitution so they were not subject to paying these import duties when shipping things to other states that had already ratified the Constitution. Okay, August 1st, 1789, the U.S. Customs Service is now established by the first Congress. And here we have a handwritten note, certificate, if you will, for importing firewood from New Brunswick. And there is a note that the import duty that is being charged is payable in Halifax currency. Again, reflecting that there is no United States national currency yet at this point. The reason it's handwritten, and we'll see a lot of import documents coming up that are printed documents with blanks in them to be filled out, but there was the generic form of the documents was fixed and printed, and that had not taken place yet. This document is dated late August 1789. By 1791, all the documents that I've seen for importing goods in 1791 are on printed forms, filled in, the blanks being filled in by hand. Okay. Well, here's an early, there were three kinds of import certificates. that had to be authenticated with an embossed seal. We call these Supervisor Seals. Each district, coinciding with a state, by the way, had a supervisor of the revenue that reported to Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of Treasury. This is the first of those three kinds of certificates that had to be authenticated with a supervisor seal. This is for imported spirits. And if you were able to read through this thing, it certifies that the spirits here, it happens to be a puncheon of rum, have been imported according to law. That means, translating that legal language, that means that the duties have indeed been paid to the supervisor of the District of New York. And here we see what that supervisor seal looks like. It doesn't identify New York directly, but there is the letter I, which you really can't see. It's off to the lower left of the wing of the eagle there in the center. And the letter I indicates that this was done, the importing was done in the state of New York. The states were given assigned letters, starting with Georgia with the letter A, South Carolina with B, and so on, traveling northward. A second kind of certificate that needed to be authenticated by an embossed seal, the supervisor seal, is wine. In fact, wine was not really being produced here in the United States at this time. And this is wine being imported into Charleston, South Carolina, and that embossed seal has the letter B. And again, this has been imported according to law, and the duties indeed have been paid. And again, we see the blow up of that supervisor seal. The third type of document that required an embossed supervisor seal was for the importation of tea. Again, this is from the Port of New York, and this is from 1794. And again, it's imported according to law. The duties have been paid. So those three kinds of documents always have a supervisor seal on them to authenticate. And these certificates stayed with the spirits, the wine, or the tea until they had all been sold. So that inspectors of the revenue could go around the city and check to see that it had been properly imported, not smuggled into the country, in other words. By 1791, Hamilton was unhappy with the amount of revenue that was coming in from import duties, and he was not retiring the debt that the country had assumed from the states when they ratified the Constitution. And Hamilton worked very hard to get Congress to establish the first internal tax on distilled spirits. That becomes effective July 1st, 1791. And here we see a certificate. You'll see the embossed seal up there in the upper left. This is from the District of Rhode Island. And again, this is, there's a little phrase in there that this was old stock. In other words, the spirits, the rum that this accompanied, the hogshead of rum, had been distilled before July 1st and therefore was exempt from the new tax beginning July 1st. And so this certificate essentially says No, they haven't paid a tax, but it is exempt because it is old stock that had been distilled before the effective date of that first internal revenue tax on distilled spirits. Here's another certificate, this from the District of Massachusetts. Again, it's New England rum that has been distilled, 113 gallons. And this is rum of the first proof. That designates all rum that is under 90 proof as we understand it today. It has been distilled from foreign materials, molasses that had been imported, and the tax was 11 cents per gallon. And again, this would have accompanied that hogshead of rum, and until it had been bottled and or put in a probably put in a earthenware container and sold. So again, this designates that the distilled spirits tax has been paid. People objected to this tax, as most of you probably know. And the first reaction to this was that in 1792, the taxes were reduced slightly on distilled spirits, spirits that had been distilled here in the United States. This is another certificate from 1792 from the District of Massachusetts. It's again rum of the first proof, under 90 proof as we understand it today. Again, it was distilled from foreign materials, and the rate now in 1792 is only 10 cents per gallon, slightly less. There's a whole schedule of these rates depending what it was distilled from. Well, the objections grew, and so Hamilton sends out some circular letters, and he says, I want you to revise the wording on the certificates so that the same kind of certificate is used on imported spirits and on domestically distilled spirits. And the only way that we can tell whether or not it is the payment of the domestic tax rate, if it was distilled domestically, is you rotate the supervisor seal such that the eagle is pointing away from the supervisor signature down there in the lower right. I want to point out that here we have the wording secured by law. In other words, the person that distilled these spirits didn't have the cash to pay the tax on the spirits, and so they posted bond. They had to post bond that they would pay. The bond had to be twice what they actually owed, so that if they had to be dragged into court, they could also charge them what it cost them to prosecute them. But again, the key there is that it is secured by law. Previously, we saw things like imported according to law, which meant that it had been paid. But the word secured means that they posted bond that they would pay. This gave them the opportunity to sell the spirits, and then they would have the money to pay the tax to the supervisor of revenue. Again, this is for a pipe of Geneva, better known today as gin, and it has been distilled in New York itself. And here we see the rotated seal. You can see that the beak of the eagle is sort of pointing roughly at 11 o'clock. The eagle is faced, the seal has been rotated so that the eagle is facing away from the signature And that's the only way that we know that this was for domestic distilled spirits as opposed to imported spirits. Collecting those certificates from the 1790s on distilled spirits with rotated seals or unrotated seals is a delightful pursuit. These aren't very plentiful, but getting an array. By the way, if you want one for domestic distilled spirits, the only states I have seen them from are New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. Guess what? We don't see them from Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. Where was the distilling being done in those states? It was being done in the western parts of those states by farmers, and they are the ones who objected most strenuously. Well, Hamilton was still not satisfied with the amount of revenue that was coming in to reduce the debt of the federal government because of all that assumed debt from the states. And so in 1794, Congress passes, at his urging, a retail license for two different kinds of retail licenses. We'll see this one is for a retail license for wine that is necessarily imported wine because there isn't wine being made here in the United States at that point. The annual fee is $5. That seal in the upper left, I haven't blown it up, but that seal is denominated $5, the amount of the annual fee for a merchant who is selling wine at retail. One of my mentors in revenue stamp collecting noted that this is the first example of a stamp or an embossed seal, if you will, that is denominated in dollars, in United States currency. All the others that we have seen so far are simply certifying, and they don't tell you what the fee was. This is a retail license for foreign distilled spirits. Again, $5. It's from the New York District. And I want to read part of what's on this certificate because all the other states have a consistent wording except for New York State. New York State, the wording for New York State is in part, provided that nothing in this license shall be deemed to authorize the selling of foreign distilled spirits at any place or in any quantity inconsistent with the laws of the state. This is, if you will, the first example of a states' rights clause. The federal government, if a state does not permit the sale of distilled spirits, or a portion of the state does not permit the sale of distilled spirits, this license does not give you permission. I might note that this was of great significance just after the Civil War. After the Civil War, we had a whole series of licenses similar to this, and in some cases, in New Jersey, for example, that had some dry portions of the state, some enterprising individuals went out and got a federal license to retail distilled spirits. And they set themselves up in business, and the state authorities came and arrested them. They eventually got this into the federal courts and went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court decision was, you're not allowed to do that. You can't, the federal government cannot authorize an activity that is forbidden by state law. States have rights. Another thing that was established in the mid-1790s is a license to operate a still. There was a charge for this. There are no embossings on this. It is just simply a wording of what the size of the still is, and that the license, the cost of the license was dependent upon the capacity of the still, and they also indicated that this was to operate from such and such a date to a different date. This is again from the state of New Jersey, a delightful piece, not listed in the Scott catalog because there's no embossing, but certainly a part of the story of the taxation of distilled spirits. And this was in addition to the per gallon tax on the distilled spirits themselves. They could, if they couldn't pay the fee for the still license, they could post bond. And it just so happens that in this case, this was in the state of Pennsylvania. Somebody apparently got a license, and they had so many months in order to pay for the license. They had posted bond twice the amount of what they owed, and they still hadn't paid. So the federal government took them to court, and this is a summons to the owner of the still to appear in court. I don't know the outcome of that particular case, but I imagine they, if they didn't get their money, they probably, this person may have wound up in jail. 1796, we still aren't getting enough money in order to reduce the national debt to satisfy Hamilton. And so we now establish an annual license on carriages for the conveyance of people. This is not carriages that would have been used on the farm or wagons on the farm, but this is strictly for the conveyance of two people. And if you were to read through this person has paid the duty of $2 for a two-wheeled carriage called a chair, owned by him, having no top. If it had a top, the duty would have been more. On wooden springs, if it had been steel springs, he would have owed a little bit more. And it is to be drawn by one horse for the conveyance of no more than one person. And so we have these carriage licenses established as another source of revenue. I'm fascinated by these licenses and these other goods, other taxes that are established during the 1790s, because my recollection from high school was that the thing that caused the greatest difficulty was the internal revenue tax on distilled spirits. As a high school student, I knew of no other taxes that were established during the 1790s, during the Federalist period. So I'm really fascinated by all the taxes that were established in order to satisfy Hamilton's goal of reducing the national debt. Finally, in 1798, we have the establishment of a tax on certain kinds of financial transactions. This happens to be a bill of exchange. It is written in Virginia, in Alexandria, Virginia, as a matter of fact, in 1798. And it is payable in England, in Liverpool, England. It is for an amount of 230 pounds sterling, payable over there, but nonetheless, a bill of exchange written here in the United States was subject to a tax. The tax on this had to do some figuring here because of exchange rates and so forth, but the actual tax was 50 cents, and there we see the embossed seal for the 50-cent tax on bills of exchange. Mortgage promises to pay, promissory notes. There are a whole list of things that are subject to this documentary tax. These are, in fact, are listed in the Scott catalog in the embossed revenue section. So that gives you a sense of the taxes that were enacted in the 1790s. In 1802, a year into the Jefferson administration, all of these taxes were eliminated. Jefferson did not believe in these, and many of these same taxes would come back again in 1814, almost at the end of the War of 1812, but we had fought the War of 1812, our second war for independence, largely on borrowed money, and finally Congress relented and established a whole set of taxes, much the same as these. There's one that I don't have an example of from the 1790s that was again used in 1814, and that is a direct tax on property. But there was, again, in the latter part of the 1790s, they established a direct tax. The way that was done was they assessed, they established how much they wanted to raise, and then that was divvied up among the states, and the states were responsible for assessing the value of property and collecting those taxes and forwarding them on to the federal government. Those certificates do exist. I don't have one to show you. Okay, that concludes my my story of the taxes of the 1790s, how we financed, and I would be glad to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ron. That was great. We do have a question, and I remember that it came in fairly early. And friends, again, if you'd like to ask questions, go ahead and use that Q&A box, and I know we'll be ready to answer that. So was that Supervisor John Lesher? That was in the beginning of your slides.
Lasher.
Lesher.
No relation to me as far as I know. My immigrant ancestors arrived in Pennsylvania in 1727, September of 1727. The captain of the ship was a man by the name of Crockett. I've done quite a bit of research, but they were farmers in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania.
That's impressive, Ron. That really is. I'm looking at the Q&A box, and I mean, I guess you might have answered everyone's question. I'm looking on the YouTube chat box. I think, here we go. How do you find these great items, and how have they survived for 2 centuries? This was something that I was just flabbergasted by myself.
That's a good question. Most of these came about in the philatelic marketplace. If you ask, how did these things survive that long? I will tell you a story about my wife's activities of the past year during the pandemic. Passed down in her family was a large wooden crate full of family correspondence dating back as far as 1804. Roughly 20 cubic feet of letters. It has taken her a year to not only read, but take notes on the letters, organize them in chronological order. We have firsthand accounts of the British activity during the War of 1812 here on the Delmarva Peninsula, raids to acquire food to feed their troops. We have letters written from Baltimore here to Easton, Maryland, where we now live, describing the arrival of the troops by train. We have somebody feeling very intimidated, very scared of the news coming from Charleston. That's the attack on Fort Sumter. How did they survive? I don't know, but we certainly have an enormous pile of family correspondence.
My mouth is agape. I cannot believe how many letters. 20 cubic feet.
20 cubic, that's a good estimate. It's probably just slightly over that. They are in close to 30 archival boxes right now, interleaved with acid-free paper, with my wife's notes on people who were mentioned in the letters, and they will probably eventually wind up in the Maryland room of our public library, because this is supported by the state here in the state of Maryland, and they have the staff that can give access to people that are doing research. Yep.
Moving on. If Jefferson did not believe in taxes, how did he propose to finance the government?
Import duties. Import duties. And borrowing.
From France or from other countries, obviously?
Yeah, well, remember, we were still importing a lot. Wine was imported, tea was imported, molasses was imported. There are lots of things still being imported and manufactured. This beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and that first took place in England. And so there are lots of things that came to the United States and were subject to these duties. So it was that, of course, all begins to fall apart at the end of the Jefferson administration, and that's the impressment of seamen and such. And so that's what leads to our second war for independence, the War of 1812.
Where did a person go to pay their tax?
That's a good question. It's certainly the import duties. The officials from the Treasury Department, the people who reported to the supervisor for the state of New York, for example, met those ships as they arrived. They had to have a bill of lading, so they knew what was aboard that ship, and they could then properly establish how much import duty was due. In other cases, we have enough people who have carriages, and people go out and collect that tax from those people that own carriages. I happen to see the Q&A here. Bill Smiley asks, the 1794 Connecticut license has a supervisor seal as well as the $5 stamp. And that is the only state in which that was true. And yes, that's part of the certification process as interpreted by the supervisor for the state of Connecticut. I might add, by the way, that notion of rotated seals, that all went out as a written note from Hamilton, that the eagle was supposed to face away from the supervisor's signature. Not every supervisor interpreted Hamilton's words exactly the same. So the rotation that I saw, that I showed earlier, certainly worked for the state that it was in, New York State, if I remember correctly. But if you go up to New Hampshire, they are rotated quite differently.
Do you know the history of hogshead as a measure of volume?
Not terribly well. I will tell you that a hogshead of beer, later on at least, is 62 gallons. But a hogshead in terms of volume is different for every product. We have hogsheads of tobacco, and we certainly don't measure tobacco in gallons. So it's a peculiar English measure, and it is peculiar to each particular good that are placed in so-called hogsheads.
We have a lot of great questions. Thanks everyone for using the Q&A box. Can you speak a bit about the Whiskey Rebellion? How long did it last and how was it resolved?
Well, Hamilton argued very convincingly for Washington to send the troops to Western Pennsylvania, and we're talking about a year now in resolving it in Western Pennsylvania. That's not the only kind of rebellion. When I lived in Pennsylvania, north of Philadelphia, we had Fry's Rebellion. We have a rebellion in Western Massachusetts, Shays Rebellion. There are various kinds of, they were not necessarily all related to distilled spirits, by the way. It's the internal revenue tax. Let me add a little bit further context to that, though. England had used import duties to support its government as well. In roughly 1719, 1720, they weren't getting enough money to operate their government. And so they established their first internal tax. Guess what it was on? Distilled spirits. And guess where those distilled spirits were made in England? They were made out in the rural areas of England. And those people objected too. They said, this is unfair. Where does all of our money go? It goes to London, Birmingham, and Manchester. And who has all those people in Parliament? Where all those people are, London, Birmingham, and Manchester. Does that sound like the kind of thing that we heard about the Whiskey Rebellion? Where did all that money go? It didn't go to those people out in the western part of Pennsylvania. That's what they objected to. This was taxation without representation, the very thing that brought on the Revolutionary War. And it wasn't new in 1776. It goes back to England. That same vocabulary was used in England 50 years before. And do we ever hear that today? I doubt that anybody in the state of Idaho objects to paying the federal taxes, do they? No, nothing has changed. Nothing has changed.
Yeah, in a former life, I sold spirits, and it was out of Western PA, and you know it's like it's part of who you are. The Whiskey Rebellion is like right here, as opposed to history. It's fascinating. Did the concept of a sin tax exist in Hamilton's time to justify taxing alcohol? And when did they start to tax tobacco?
Here in the United States, the taxation of tobacco begins during the Civil War in the North. I do not know. I do not know the history of taxation of tobacco in other countries. I would say that playing cards were taxed in England in the 18th century. And that comes about during the Civil War again in the Union, the taxation of the devil's cards. So yes, that notion of sin tax certainly goes back to England, as I mentioned before, the early part of the 18th century.
When did revenue stamps and excise stamps wind down? Was the introduction of income tax related to the reduction in revenue stamps and excise taxes?
No, not initially, at least. We have an income tax, by the way, during the Civil War. They tried establishing it again in the 1890s, and the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional, even though it had not been challenged during the Civil War. And that was the motivation for the 16th Amendment to the Constitution that established the income tax during the teens of the early part of the 20th century. The winding down of tax stamps, as we know them, really becomes big in the 1960s. The silver tax stamps were still used in the early 1960s. The documentary stamps were used until the end of 1967. If you look at the congressional hearings in the early 1960s, they're beginning to say that it is a much more efficient way to collect revenue using the income tax rather than this very piecemeal and rather expensive way of collecting all these other taxes. And it's in the 1960s that we see this elimination of, for the most part, of tax stamps.
So during this time, were the taxes paid with paper currency or hard currency like silver or gold? Was the method noted in the documents?
It certainly is not mentioned in the documents. There is no national currency until the Civil War again. There was hard currency, copper, silver, and gold coin. I would assume that is one way of paying it. There are checking accounts, and so money moves around based on checks where there's no actual hard currency during this period of time. We certainly see some of that in the bills of exchange and bank checks, by the way. I don't have very much of that. One thing that some of the listeners may be interested in here is that in the 1780s, I have a check that is written in 90ths of a dollar. And that, if you do some research online, you will see that the dollar was denominated not in hundredths, but 90ths, particularly because of certain exchange rates. And I can't tell you exactly which exchange rates, but that is the explanation that I have read.
I think that currency, the uniform currency, as we were talking about the other day, universal. Finally, our last question is, and please feel free, friends, if you'd like to ask any more. Did you find any documents on taxes for slaves?
We certainly see those in the Civil War era on manumission papers. There is a tax on those manumission papers. There are taxes on property where slaves are implicated. I don't have any of those, but I'm certainly aware of those, and I don't know to what extent we see those in the 1790s. We certainly see it much later in the 1860s.
Another question just came in, Ron. Of the revenue stamps, do you have a favorite?
No.
Not even something that you would want to allude to? Or?
Oh, I don't know. Favorite is a difficult thing to interpret here. I have pursued some very unusual kinds of things. Certainly these carriage certificates.
Mm.
I have a certificate from 1816 paying the $1 tax on a silver watch. Why were watches taxed? This is not the grandfather's clock in your house. Well, these are a luxury. Who needed a pocket watch in 1816? As a matter of fact, I have searched the individual who had this watch and paid the $1 tax on a silver watch. By the way, the tax was $2 for a gold watch. He happened to be a ship's captain. And in order to do proper navigation, you need to know exactly what the time is. But we didn't travel long distances other than the ship's captains. And even in the beginning of the 1870s, every town had a different time based on establishing when it was noon in their city. If you traveled a few miles west, the sun wasn't at its peak until a little bit later time, and so their clocks didn't match, but they didn't need to. They didn't need to.
I'm that concept is just mind blowing, actually, to think about what life must have been like, where that concept of time wasn't as rigid as it is now.
Well, look, in this town of Easton, there was a clock on the courthouse. If you lived in Easton and you wanted to know what the time was, you looked at the courthouse. You didn't need it. And if you were on a farm, you got up when the cock crowed in the morning, and you went to bed when the sun went down in the evening. It was as simple as that.
It sounds very simple.
Yep.
Have one of our attendees has said that he's seen some of your exhibits, and his favorite are your exhibits of state beer stamps, including some for breweries that still exist.
Yes, yes. And it's nice to see both the state and the federal tax stamps together, still surviving together. There's only one state which you can accumulate a reasonable number of those things still glued together, and that's the state of Pennsylvania, where I grew up. They're very, very scarce from any other state.
What revenue stamp or paper would you like to have and have pursued for some to a long time, but are still pursuing?
Oh, I don't know.
Okay, the list goes on and on.
It's the stories behind the stamps, not necessarily the stamp itself.
Mhm.
We sometimes acquire stamps that we don't fully understand, and that drives me to do the research to find out what this stamp was doing. And sometimes the stamps on documents, it's not clear why the number of stamps are on there. It's like the analysis of these documents is much like the analysis of a postal cover, in which you need to explain whether the proper rate is being paid, and sometimes it takes quite a bit of research to determine that indeed it is the proper rate, but you have to interpret the laws and the regulations in order to find out. And it's that research that really drives me on more than the pursuit of any given particular stamp.
Mm. Well said. And finally, we have a person who'd like to know Persian rug tax stamp.
Oh, yes. Well, I don't own one. I'm almost sure that I never will. It's not an area that I have collected. This is from 1871 and 2. It was in use for a relatively short period of time. It's a high denomination. It was only used on very large transactions. And so I just don't collect that area at all anymore. And I see a good friend, Alan Hicks, wants to know the document in the background of my picture. This is a document that was printed by one of the banknote companies. It's an engraved certificate. It is a drawback certificate. If you imported some things, some raw materials, and you manufactured something, and you then exported those manufactured goods from those what were originally imported materials, you could apply for a drawback of the money that you paid for those raw materials. And this indeed is one of those certificates. My certificate is not unique. There are a number of these. Mine has a 5-cent first issue certificate stamp on it, which this is a general certificate and was subject to the 5-cent certificate tax. Some of them don't have that on because other people interpreted that since this was a government document itself, it was not subject to the tax. So the law was indeed not uniformly applied. Drawback certificate. Good to hear from you, Alan.
Well, once again, it's just fantastic to realize that stamps teach. It's just amazing. I've learned so much in this stamp chat. Thank you very, very much. Please go ahead, Ron, and look at the chat box. You have accolades, people saying thank you, and so I definitely want you to enjoy that. I'm trying to find my camera. But anyway, you don't have to see me. There's Ron Lesher. Thank you so much. I hope that this took the sting out of, tax day a little bit by learning, the history of it. I think that was really a lot of fun. And I hope that if you're a teacher or someone who is sort of in an educational field, that you share this with another. I mean, at this point, it's kind of a presentation I think that all Americans would appreciate, again, to take that sting out of tax day. Anyway, please join me, friends, for in thanking Ron Lesher for this outstanding presentation. Once again, the take-home message is stamps teach, and Ron is a presenter and instructor for this year's summer seminar. So you can go check him out and what classes he's offering, and the whole bevy of summer seminar series is online at stamps.org. Stamp Chat is a production of the American Philatelic Society with membership starting at just $25. You can join 135 years of international fellowship in the hobby and start taking advantage of member benefits now. Whether you're researching, shopping on Stamp Store, or renewing your membership, it's stampstore.org. Thank you for joining us. You'll find this and more Stamp Chats on the APS YouTube channel. Like, subscribe, and use the comment box to keep the conversation going. Until our next Stamp Chat, connect, collect, learn, and be inspired. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and of course on stamps.org, the American Philatelic Society, social since 1886. Thanks so much, Ron, for joining us, and thanks everyone for being on the call and for your great questions. Have a good night.